Hello, hello, everyone. I hope you all are having a great time in the city of Las Vegas and at Black Hat so far. We're honored that you're choosing to spend the end of your first day hanging out with us. It's going to be a really fun time, promise. This is our talk, Surfacing a Hydra, Unveiling a Multi-Headed State-Sponsored Campaign Against a Foreign Government. But before we get into what we're going to be talking about today, we should probably introduce ourselves. So today you're going to be able to spend a whole 40 minutes with Eminem. Unfortunately, not the candy or the hip-hop rapper, but even better, Morgan and Mark. We worked very closely on this investigation as part of Sophos's Managed Detection and Response Operations team, which works to provide services to roughly over 25,000 organizations. My name is Morgan Demboski, and I work as a threat intel analyst on that team who aims to analyze and enrich the data that's being collected by our operations and our hunt teams. Outside of work, I currently live in Washington, D.C., where I like to think of myself as an up-and-coming pottery artist and emerging beach volleyball superstar.
Hey, folks. My name is Mark Parsons. I'm a threat hunter for the MDR operations team. It is my pleasure and honor to actually get to find and discover new and unfound evil through all these customers. Well, I should in no way be an artist or let near any kind of doodling. I am a passionate snowboarder and a loving dog dad when I'm not hunting for new evil.
All right, so now that you know who we are, let's get into the fun stuff. So today we're going to be talking about a campaign that we call Operation Crimson Palace. And that actually went down in 2 stages. It's a Chinese APT cyber espionage campaign, and we had in fact published on the first stage of this campaign in June of this year, which involved multiple active state-sponsored groups, or what we refer to as Cluster Alpha, Cluster Bravo, and Cluster Charlie, as we'll talk about here in a second, coordinating their activity to maintain long-term access to the same foreign government agency from at least March to August of 2023. And we'll also be talking about previously unpublished research about the second stage of this campaign that began at the end of September 2023 following our actions to block the actor's C2 implants. And this second stage was characterized not only in a complete change of pace and tactics by the actors, but also an expansion of activity to other critical organizations in the same region. But talking about a little bit about the agenda here, we are going to be talking about those 2 stages, but our goal here is to really shine a light on our side of the investigation into this very long-running campaign, which, as you could probably guess, was not a walk in the park. So we're going to get real with you guys, and we're going to share the challenges that we faced. And our goal here is to not only provide effective analysis methods for overcoming these challenges, but also to show why it's so important to be flexible in your analysis and what we can learn from this campaign about the wider Chinese APT threat landscape. So starting off with a little bit of background here, specifically about the victimology. So we first uncovered this campaign targeting a government organization in a Southeast Asian country, which is known to have quite a bit of conflict with China over territory and resources in the South China Sea. And as we'll discuss here in a bit, it is of very, very high intelligence value to the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. And as we mentioned, in January 2024, this campaign expanded to other organizations in the same region. But when we were first investigating this campaign, we ran into some immediate challenges. And what that came down to was the fact that the target organization is what we characterize as a mixed estate, which means that Sophos MDR and XDR cover only a subset of the environment. So we lacked full visibility over the entire network. What's more is that the customer was actually onboarded with an existing long-term breach. So they were already infected prior to when they were onboarded as an MDR customer. So we were not able to determine the mode of initial access. We were able to find some related activity dating back to early 2022, which does indicate that the threat actors had long-standing access on at least some unmanaged assets in the network. But in addition to having this lack of visibility, we also kind of had our hands tied in terms of response actions. According to our MDR contract with this client, we did not have authorization to take full remediation actions, which left our team in a bit stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, we couldn't act to fully remediate the compromise, but we also couldn't just sit there and do nothing while these Chinese actors were running rampant. which led us to the question, as analysts and defenders, specifically those who work for vendors, if we can't take mitigation actions directly within an environment, what can we do to make the most of the situation? And so that's what we really tried to zoom in here on for this investigation, is we might not be able to fully wipe the threat actors from the network, but we can continually monitor their activity, and we can work to impede their tooling and make their jobs harder, which is what we successfully aim to do in this investigation, as we'll discuss here in a second. But now that you know a little bit about what Operation Crimson Palace is and the situation that we were in, I'm going to throw it over to Mark to talk about how we initially uncovered this intrusion in the initial threat hunt that kicked off the investigation.
Thanks, Morgan. Hi, folks. So, how did we find Operation Crimson Palace? And before we get into the threat hunt that got us here, I should probably tell you what threat hunting actually is. Threat hunting is assuming that the threat actor has evaded your defenses in some manner, and on top of that, you use a variety of different methods or framework to try and identify this hopefully rare activity. One of the methods that we like to use at Sophos specifically is a thesis-driven hunting methodology, where we will create a very precise statement of what we think evil looks like. Then we will query our logs to identify matching patterns of behavior and use the context around that event to determine is it actually malicious or not. So in this specific threat hunt, PowerShell TCP client, our hunt thesis centers around PowerShell being used as a command and control channel, specifically the PowerShell class TCP client. The first piece of context, though, is the VMnet executable that you'll see on the top left there with that start, that blue box. And the execution from that directory was actually from a VMware executable operating from a Microsoft Vault directory. It then used the TCP client mechanism to call to a .info domain. I don't know about you. I don't keep my VMware executables in a Microsoft directory, and I certainly don't let them communicate to rare TLDs like .infos. So this is what we thought was pretty interesting. And then we moved on to that second item, all right, that red box Sophos UD. That was an unsigned binary, and I can tell you for a fact that Sophos doesn't use unsigned binaries. This was a masquerade, the threat actor purporting themselves to be us. And then finally, that third item, that bottom red box, SSL WND64, this one made us jump. And that's because it maintained an exact hash match with a piece of nation-state malware called PhantomNet. So all these things together, we decided we really needed to dig into the environment. And if this is overwhelming to you, it was to us. And that's because we were sitting there laying out all of these different attacks, and we noticed it's everywhere. And it became to be known as what we like to call, in our closed circle, a critical high yikes situation. Yeah, so typically a lot of threat actors will move in a linear progression through the environment. In this instance, they weren't doing that. They were moving back and forth on one another. And they were deploying different C2 channels and different mechanisms. And threat actors just don't typically operate like that. Why move back and forth on yourself if you've already penetrated the system? So that's when I came up with a bit of a wild hunch. That's me on the left. We're supposed to be. I don't smoke. But I do draw pretty atypical correlations from data. I thankfully have a very supportive team. And they said, Mark, that's an interesting theory, which my theory was, maybe there's not just one actor. Maybe there's 2 or 3. And so they wanted me to prove it. I was like, OK. So I combed my mustache, and I dove into the logs. And this is when we started to actually uncover the different threat clusters. How do we do that? We grabbed every single bit of data and information that we could. We grabbed authentication information to try and understand where compromised accounts were authenticating to and from, the file creation data, so when malware built something else, we knew it was connected, network telemetry, so when something communicated externally, we knew where they were going. And then from there, we started to build attack flows, and these are what serve as the cornerstones for our clusters. And you may all sit here and be wondering, Mark, do you know your alphabet? Why are you talking about cluster Bravo? Well, it brings me to the first point I want to make, which is analysts, we need to be flexible in our thinking. The first identification we made was actually from cluster alpha, that VMnet thing that I just showed you a few slides back. So what we identified when we actually built out and collected all this data was cluster Bravo was first. And so we chronologically are going to present this information to you in that manner. So we're going to, again, create our attack flows by looking at the attack vector, or the machine the actors authenticated from, the account they used to authenticate, finally, the target machine they're going to compromise, the malware that they deployed when they were there, and then the C2 domain that malware would communicate to, and finally, the IP infrastructure that hosted that domain. So the attacker started with this desktop machine, They then used the admin F account to compromise the DC sync machine where they deployed some custom malware called ccorridor. They quickly cleaned up after themselves, moving laterally to the AMS machine using the exact same account, where they deployed their ccorridor malware again. This time, though, they deployed the agent shim attack, which is an evasion technique we'll cover in a few seconds. And then they used the lolbin RDR leak diag to capture credentials. They waited a few days, then they authenticated with the local administrator account to the file server where they deployed the ccorridor malware again. There was a difference, though. This one communicated externally to the message.ugai domain. They very quickly generated a scheduled task where they, under the user J context, moved laterally to the hypervisor and deployed their ccorridor malware again. I want to pause for a sec. If you can see that blue pentagon. Now, something that I'm not taking into account is time. The day before, cluster alpha had been to this same machine and deployed malware. What was incredibly interesting is that after cluster Bravo deployed there, they actually paused for a few days. And they'd been typically very good about cleaning up all of their malware after themselves. And so why would you pause? Well, there might be other actors coordinating their work together. And when they came back, they did something very different. Instead of attacking servers, they started attacking endpoints, specifically through a remote scheduled task where they deployed their ccorridor malware again. We repeated this exact same process with cluster alpha. They attacked primarily from the VPN subnet. They used a different subset of accounts. They attacked a different subset of machines. From there, they deployed a very different piece of malware as their primary mechanism for C2, specifically that VMnet or Merlin C2 agent right there. This went on to deploy a variety of other pieces of malware throughout the environment. And by deploy, I mean it physically wrote that to disk. So very high and strong correlation there. That doesn't mean that there weren't standalone instances of other pieces of malware. Those would go on to deploy, again, the same pieces of malware. So again, the reason we're noting this right now is there's strong overlap. This malware created this malware created this malware. And on top of that, there's additional correlation. Their IP addresses that were hard-coded into the malware were communicating to the exact same servers. So not only, this gives us confidence in creating our clusters, where we're saying they're created by the same thing, and then they're communicating back to the same thing. And then there was additional overlap in the Phantom Net and eagerBee samples as well. And then there were also standalone instances of infrastructure that we correlated that were, again, separate from the Bravo and Charlie clusters. These are going to be in the slides, don't worry. And on top of that, there's cluster Charlie. We did the exact same pattern. They attacked just once from the VPN subnet. They deployed one time to the admin C account, moving to the 365 machine, where they then deployed the POCO proxy sample as a masquerading DLL. They used a different subset of accounts. You'll notice overlap with cluster Bravo. And then on top of that, they chose to routinely work from compromised endpoints, though. They again did that through POCO proxy, which we saw create itself over and over again. And then that POCO proxy sample created persistent iterations of itself, as well as the McAfee file lock sideload, which it was used as a potential credential capture. There were additional pieces of malware created, specifically the LSA credential interceptor for credential access, the HUI loader for C2 or command and control, and then finally almost AT-exec, which is a slightly modified version of the Impacket AT-exec module. What was particularly interesting as well is the domains associated with this malware all maintained a speed test component to them. Again, this is all a different subset of malware. So again, we have additional confidence and correlation that we're drawing between these clusters. And again, their IP hosting infrastructure was all different. So now that I've discussed these clusters and how we created them, Morgan's going to talk to you about how they look over time and against one another.
Thank you very much. So as Mark just beautifully laid out there for us, at this point we had a pretty solid conception of the 3 different attack flows. But now we wanted to take it one step further and turn those attack flows into clusters of activity. Now, a threat activity cluster is a group of related malicious activity exhibiting specific patterns of behaviors that can serve as a basis for tracking. And by using clustering, we were able to add context to those 3 attack flows, which led to the creation of the 3 clusters that you see here. And Sophos refers to these as security threat activity clusters, or stacks. But for the purpose of talking about them publicly, and as Mark just kind of hinted at, we gave them the nicknames of Cluster Alpha, Cluster Bravo, and Cluster Charlie. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that clustering is an important step to figuring out the who behind the mask. But instead of just creating new threat actors, clustering allows you to be flexible in your analysis and look at attacks over time. And you're able to split off and merge clusters as we or other analysts in the field find additional data, which is important because as you see here, though these 3 attack clusters have different attack chains, TTPs, malware, and infrastructure, they also shared several overlaps. And we're going to get into more about the nature of these clusters and the relations between them. But at this point, we were just trying to build as complete a picture as possible based on the data that we had. Correlating multiple log sources, leveraging and enriching the telemetry we had available, and now it was time to correlate our intel with public reporting. Which leads us to any threat intelligence analyst's very favorite topic, attribution. As many of us in this room are probably familiar with, attribution is very challenging and very complex, especially when it comes to Chinese APT actors who are very commonly known to share tooling and infrastructure. I mean, this campaign in itself is a reminder of just how extensively these groups do share their tooling and how much overlap there is between reported actors. I mean, just within Cluster Alpha, we identified TTP and malware overlap with 4 separately reported threat actors. And when it comes to attribution in the cyber threat landscape, I think a really accurate analogy to describe the situation is the parable of the blind man and an elephant. Which, as you could probably guess, is a story about a group of blind men who have never seen an elephant before, and they try to describe it by each touching a different part of the elephant, and what that leads to is for each of them to describe it and categorize it differently. And I think the same could be said about the cybersecurity industry. You have all of these vendors and all of these companies looking at a different piece of the puzzle and trying to put a name to it, which can prevent them from seeing the full picture. And what we learned through this clustering effort is that focusing too much on any single Chinese attribution runs the risk of missing trends about how these groups coordinate their operations. So instead of just, creating threat actors, it makes sense to instead create clusters of activity so that, you can figure out how it connects to and fits into existing bodies of reporting so that we, as an industry, can build a more full picture of the elephant that is offensive Chinese cyber operations. But now, at this point, we had collected our telemetry. We had a pretty solid conception of these 3 attack clusters. We'd correlated with public reporting, but more evidence and analysis was needed to lend higher confidence to our assessments. So in an effort led by our lovely colleague, Colin Cowie, we took that unified picture of all of the data that Mark had mentioned earlier, and we removed the obvious signs of automation to really zoom in on the hands-on keyboard activity with the goal of really getting to know our adversary. And in doing this time of day analysis, the first thing that we noticed was all of this all of this activity was occurring within Chinese working hours of 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Chinese Standard Time, which lended pretty high confidence that we were in fact dealing with China-based actors. But what's more is when we split these into clusters and compared them, it became clear that they were favoring different times and days of the week to be active. Cluster Alpha seemed to concentrate their activities on Fridays. Cluster Bravo favored Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. And Cluster Charlie really tended to favor Mondays. And we saw similar differences when we looked at the activity by day. So not only did they favor different times and days of the week, but they also seemed to almost schedule their activity around one another. At some points, it appeared that Cluster Alpha and Cluster Charlie were alternating activity by day. There was a period in June where Cluster Alpha was active, and then they went dormant for a period of 3 days as Cluster Charlie swept in, performed a huge peak of activity, and then went silent again, and Cluster Alpha resumed their activity. So there were multiple examples of things like this that lended higher confidence to not only A, the existence of these 3 different threat clusters, but also B, that these threat actors in these clusters may be aware of the other's activities. But at this point, we'd collected all of the telemetry that we could, and we tried to add context to it, but it was time to go beyond just looking at the data, and we really needed to start connecting the dots here.
So here's where we get to really dive into who these actors are. We discussed how they did their work, but let's figure out what's behind them and coordinate this identification a little bit more tightly. I want to zoom in on cluster Bravo first. Now, what's a hallmark of every single cluster is they maintain a different defense evasion technique. These are expensive to develop and very challenging. Specifically, cluster Bravo's mechanism was they were going to take a renamed instance of ntdll.dll, write it to disk, map it to their C2 process, and then delete it rapidly in about 20 different times in under a single second. The intention behind this, it was hopefully shim our telemetry off of the process so that their later actions would go undetected by our agent. How did they do this? How did they move about the environment? They used a different, yet at the time, unknown and unreported version or piece of malware called C-Corridor. And then finally, preliminary targeting. What did they do with all that capability? They were actually targeting not only the IT administrators within the environment, but they were targeting secretaries. These are the individuals that will see lots of documents across their desk, so it's particularly different than how other groups would target or how you would normally presume that targeting to occur. Cluster Alpha was markedly different. They did precise recon. What I mean by that is that they took their time. They would specifically highlight IT administrators and directors of programs. They would query their authentication logs for multiple months at a single time, pause and wait 4 hours to 4 days, taking their time. They were highly precise in their reconnaissance. They knew who they wanted to go after because, again, they're mapping out how the government, these things functioned and flowed from an organizational perspective. On top of that, how did they do this? They abused vendor tools. They did DLL sideloading of vendor binaries, and then their evasion mechanism was whole and totally different. They did DNS blackholing. And the way that they did this is their eagerby sample would insert a driver into the network stack, and from there it would monitor DNS queries that were made by that machine, and if it identified a domain associated with a known and common EDR vendor, it would zero-pad byte that packet, essentially blackholing it. So if you're a defensive operator, you're just seeing the machine not communicate and go offline. So markedly different mechanism for evasion. After that, they were testing in production. If you can recall that VMnet execution, they used a PowerShell scripting interface to first communicate to that domain infrastructure, but then they deployed a binary, and that binary communicated that exact same infrastructure only a few hours later. And they didn't just do that testing in a singular mechanism where they're saying, okay, can my implant phone home? They were doing it over months, where they would deploy a single instance of a piece of malware or a backdoor, they would wait a month, and it would go undetected, and we would wait a month, and they would deploy it with a very slight variation in its code, but it achieved the exact same thing. Why would you deploy tooling that you know already works, and why would you try to leave that in the hands of the defenders? Because they're testing us. They're learning from our responses and identifying what it is that we can detect, because they're going to use it elsewhere. Finally, Cluster Charlie. They had their eyes on the long game. What I mean by this is they deployed the most set of implants throughout the environment, and they used an unreported POCO proxy sample to do it. A wholly different mechanism as the other two clusters. Their actions on objective were very different from the others. They conducted recon against large swaths of the user base, and they were noisy. What I mean by noisy is that they were launching hundreds of process executions at a single time, simultaneously across 2 domain controllers at the same instant. They then took that data back, scraped it programmatically, and within minutes were firing off ping sweeps to all of those machines. And I envision this as them mapping out the environment, seeing who they can get to and how. Finally, how did they abuse, what did they do in their tooling stack? They again abused DLL sideloading for AV vendor binaries, but their evasion technique was very different. They used unreported AV vendor binaries that were exploitable to perform EDR bypass. Finally, another aspect that, in our opinion, led some confidence that the theory that maybe they were aware of one another is that we took a bunch of isolated at the time events, and then we kept in mind and patterned them over time that there are multiple actors. And we identified waves of activity where we see Cluster Bravo working as a setup group, deploying their C-Corridor malware as initial implants. We saw Cluster Alpha performing that precise reconnaissance. And then finally, we see Cluster Charlie profiting off of the other actors, using all of that tooling to actually deploy keyloggers and as we would later see in the later stages of the campaign, would capture documents.
Yeah, so in light of the hallmarks of what we knew about each of these clusters, we really wanted to narrow in on the objectives. What were these clusters really trying to do? Did they have different motivations and purposes, and did those objectives support each other in any way? And through our assessment, we believe that there was a division of labor in how these groups conducted their operations. Like Mark just mentioned, Cluster Bravo, they were kind of the setup crew. Cluster Alpha, they really liked zooming in on the precise recon, while Cluster Charlie focused on the actions on objectives. So in a nutshell, what we were seeing here was a specialization in their objectives. And what's more than that is when looking at the timing, the overlap, the coordination of these objectives, what we came to assess is that distinct clusters are representing separate threat groups that are working underneath the overarching directive of a central state authority. We can't really put our finger on what that central overarching authority is. We will say that some of the reported threat groups that we found these clusters overlapped with have been attributed to China's Ministry of State Security, though we need more evidence to be able to say that for sure. And since we don't have a lot of time today to talk about the structure of China's offensive cyber operations, there was a great talk at Black Hat Asia this year on just that topic that we highly recommend that you go check out if you're interested. However, no matter what that overarching organization was, one thing that we do know about them is that they are extremely well-resourced. Basically, China's got stacks of cash, that is. Just looking at the facts here, we had 3 distinct activity clusters, 2 of which were performing activity almost every week for months at a time, all against the same target of political interest. They were extremely persistent, and they had an extensive toolbox at their disposal, to the point that they were even playing around with which tactics and tooling worked best. And this kind of activity requires an immense amount of resources and dollar bills that you just don't see with your everyday cyber criminal. And what this also told us is that this target is of such high intelligence priority that they're willing to put an immense amount of time, resources, and money to maintain access to it. And that persistence and dedication to maintaining consistent operations became even more clear in stage 2. So in August 2023, as we'd mentioned, we had a several-week period of dormancy following our actions to block the actor's C2 implants. And at that time, Cluster Alpha, they essentially went dark. We did not see any activity aligning with Cluster Alpha post-August 2023. So we finally thought we had a chance to catch our breath. But we were quite wrong. Little did we know that Cluster Charlie was preparing to come back with a vengeance. So in the end of September 2023, Cluster Charlie reemerged in the network. But with their custom POCO proxy implants being blocked, they took a new approach. So using previously compromised credentials, they deployed web shells on the organization's web app server, and they used it to perform precise recon. And with that, they were performing that in a very quick sequence of activities that all happened under 45 minutes. And that commenced what we call stage 2 of the Operation Crimson Palace campaign. And that was marked by a total change in pace by the actors. In stage 2, in addition to the actions on objectives, which we'll talk about here in a moment, they were really focused on extending their foothold by bypassing EDR software and rapidly cycling through their C2 channels in order to reestablish their access when their implants were being blocked. And to do that, they were using a range of different open source and off-the-shelf tooling. They also placed an emphasis on masquerading, such as abusing AV vendor tools to sideload their malicious implants. They were also making mistakes, like in their service DLL sideloads that caused a lot of extra time and work that wasn't necessary. But don't let those mistakes fool you, because what they were doing here was not child's play. As I mentioned, and as we've mentioned probably many times now, Cluster Charlie really prioritized their actions on objectives, which came in a couple of different forms. So in December, they began to really focus on targeted espionage activity, not only collecting sensitive information related to the country's strategies in the South China Sea, but also keys to their cloud infrastructure, configuration data for their entire IT infrastructure, voice over IP phone database files that could be used to restore messages, and much more. They were also deploying keyloggers, including a previously unreported keylogger that we've dubbed Tattletale, which among other things had the ability to fingerprint the compromised system, steal LSA info, and collect storage and Edge and Chrome browser data history. So what they were really trying to do here was be able to make sure that they were going to be able to maintain access to this environment in the long term. I mean, if they knew every single thing there was to know about this organization's infrastructure, and they had a trove of compromised credentials, it's going to be really, really, really hard for this organization to keep them out. And when we look at the timeline of stage 2 activity, I mean, you can see the extent of all that they were trying to do. Just a couple examples here. I mean, they were using the Havoc C2 tool to inject into other processes, which in one case led to the deployment of the open source Sharphound tool for Active Directory infrastructure mapping. They were performing service DLL sideloads. They were deploying EDR bypass tools. They were targeting Sophos binaries in their recon, deploying Cobalt Strike, conducting LSAS dumps, you name it. It was a lot of activity. And this activity continued through the first half of 2024. And in 2024, it became very apparent that these actors were rapidly rotating their C2 channels in order to maintain access as Sophos was detecting and blocking their implants. And they also were changing how they wrapped and deployed their malicious payloads, which Mark is going to give us some insight into right now.
C2 framework analysis. Sounds really boring, but it's actually what it looks like to combat an APT actor over 28 weeks. So C2 framework, you can think of it as a command and control framework that essentially allows a threat actor to perform the business of hacking. It allows them to deploy different payloads and remotely control compromised machines. I'm not an artist, so I apologize. But I want you to understand that this diagram, every line is a different mechanism or type of attack, with every colored line representing a different C2 framework. So the top left is their custom C2. That's what they used at the very beginning when they repenetrated the environment. In our assessment, that's because they wanted to remain undetected. They quickly migrated to the Havoc C2 framework, which is that big orange line right there. And what's particularly interesting about this is while it was successful, right in the middle, they actually deployed Cobalt Strike, that little small blue dot. Why, if your technique is working, are you deploying something else? In our opinion, it's because they knew they were going to eventually be stopped and they wanted alternatives. And when we eventually did stop them at the end of January, they came back with a vengeance, deploying not one, not two, but 3 different command and control implants in the exact same day. Those LSAS injection items, those 2 little orange and blue dots there, those DLLs were named the exact same thing. They were deployed to machines alphabetically, one after the other. They were deployed 1 hour and within the exact same hour. Now, what's different is that the Cobalt Strike was using a reflective loader. Havoc C2 was using a different mechanism to inject their code into memory. They're testing us. This is A/B testing, where you take one set of data, see what works, throw another one out there, see what works. They're trying to see and study us and understand what can we block and what do we miss? How can they continue to evade us? After that, they've shifted to a different mechanism when we blocked that, specifically using a standalone binary that was vulnerable to DLL sideloading that they bring with them. That's that libsef DLL item. And then when we caught that, they shifted a different phase of their entire attack. That was specifically in the Gibro C2 framework. So they're using a wholly different toolkit now because we've been continuing to battle them and resist them. After we caught that, they modulated back to what was kind of working. And then finally, they used the JLI DLL, a different sideload mechanism where they used a shellcode loader, changing yet again another aspect of their entire attack chain. They continued to, when we caught that, they changed to a different shellcode loader. After that, they changed to a different binary, modulating different aspects. Finally, by the time in mid-April when we were programmatically blocking them, they went dark for a few weeks. I got to pause. And then they deployed another different custom C2 framework at the bottom to maintain access in a different mechanism, in a different way. What does this mean? They're taking a tactical approach. They're going to start with their custom frameworks to make sure they're not seen, but then they're going to move to open source tools that they don't have to spend time to develop. After that, this also represents the fact that they have a deep tool set. Do you think that your environment could withstand 28 different types of attack over 28 weeks? What about if they shortened that and deployed it over 2 weeks? Would you catch every single instance of that? They have a lot of capability at their disposal. They're also conducting A/B testing. They're placing these things alongside one another to not only just see what's effective, but to see how they can evade us and study us as defenders. Now, if you're a little tired by this, I was too. It got really frustrating. And if you recall those heat maps, I felt pretty confident that I could stay online and I could actually catch their samples. So I stayed up one night till 10 p.m. at night and kept refreshing through this environment, hoping to just catch them when they landed on disk and snag some of their implants because I had nothing better to do. Well, this was me. They didn't show up. They actually showed up at 1 a.m. that night. That hurt. And I said to myself, I'm never going to do this again. So I built a tool that we're going to give away to you called the Spade tool, and this allows you to conduct your own threat hunting. The way that this works is it's going, and I'm not meant to create slogans. I call it the Spade tool because it helps you dig, and then I threw it into ChatGPT, and it said session process anomaly and discovery and enumeration, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be online. I encourage you to check it out there. And there's a lot that's going to happen right here. It's online. Read it there. But this attempts to show you how a hunter can think about the environment and focus in on human aspects of their attack. So we're going to look at discovery commands like who am I, ping. It allows the attacker to understand the environment. And while a lot of detection engineers will try to look at one instance of that, we're looking at 25,000 environments. We're going to look at a bunch. Not only that, we're going to look at them over time because we're, again, looking to identify and track operators, not machines. So we're going to fraction time into sessions that we'll call 2-hour time blocks, and we're going to look for a subset of these commands. After that, we're then going to, this is an example of a whole bunch of them, and again, we don't want to find automation, we want to find human actors. So we're going to take those repetitive sessions, we're going to get rid of them. Same with those ones that are having high process counts, indicative of automation. After we have that smaller subset on that single host, we're going to look across the entire environment because we have 25,000 environments to monitor, not just one. And so we're going to then say, do we see that parent process in that discovery subset happening a bunch of places? If so, that's probably automation or it's a unique configuration. We don't care about it. We're going to then focus in on other aspects. Now that we have a small subset of hosts, there's only 3 here. But if we have 25,000 environments, we have 3 hits per environment. That's 75,000 environments. I'm already tired of talking about it. So we're going to look at another aspect of command and control, and that's the network infrastructure. They don't communicate to everything. They don't have a lot of external network connections. They only have a few. And so we're going to take out parent processes that are looking at making multiple connections, and we're going to focus on just one. And that's how we kept pace with them over time. And we used this to over 25,000 endpoints, or environments, so even more endpoints than that, and I was able to find their C2 implants every time. So we're going to be giving this away. I encourage you to check it out. And Cluster Charlie wasn't the only one that was active. Cluster Bravo was as well, which Maureen will talk about right now.
Yeah, so as Mark said, Cluster Charlie was not the only one that revitalized their activity. Even though Cluster Bravo was only seen in the target environment for a 3-week period in March 2023, that did not mean that they just disappeared into the wind. Actually, it turns out that they just had new clients on their to-do list. And since January 2024, Sophos has detected activity associated with Cluster Bravo at least 11 other organizations in the same region. And in addition to that, we also discovered them using previously compromised government agencies as a C2 relay point and also as a staging ground for their malware and their tooling. And that brings us kind of to our takeaways here. The first of which is that there is no happy ending. As much as we may want there to be, and as much as we may have wanted to, we all did not happily ride off into the sunset together. These actors are still active in this environment and in many other networks as well, probably globally. And so that's why it's so important to share this intelligence. I mean, APT actors like this are not just going to disappear, which is why we need to work together in order to be effective. Mark, what else did we learn from this investigation?
I'm really excited you're all here. Thank you for attending. China has been completing these actions for the past 10 years and only shows that they're going to increase their pace. In the appendix to our show notes, we included 3 pieces of research. However, the past year, they have continued to change their tactics at a staggering pace. They are operationalizing a vast amount of resources and capability. We really encourage you to check them out. They've been doing this for 10 years and they're not going to stop. Intelligence-driven threat hunting is a requirement for the modern-day enterprise. Focus on the operator behind the keyboard. So what I mean by that is that these are human beings that are creating these actions. We need to focus on their patterns, and we can track those patterns to identify them as they move throughout the world. They're not just machines. The exploits are going to change. The actors and their objectives are going to remain consistent. Track those. Finally, logs are cheaper than lawyers. What I mean by that is that you need to deploy your sensors everywhere. Please, I beg you, everywhere. But on top of that, if you're calling up the lawyer because you're about to enter a defer engagement, that's going to start costing money just to pick up the phone. On top of that, if you're able to prove that there was no exfiltration because you have those logs, it's going to be a lot cheaper to manage the situation. Finally, and here you can see them on the slides, We have to acknowledge a lot of other people. We are representing just a few people at Sophos that conducted this research and helped us. These are fantastic individuals that really worked incredibly hard to bring this over the line. We have to thank them. A few of them are in the crowd. Thank you very much for your work. This was not just us, a whole bunch more. Any questions, folks? If so, we have 20 seconds. I don't know if you're able to even make it to these mics, but there's going to be a wrap room. We can talk with you there. Thank you very much for your time, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.